Hello everybody, and welcome to this video. My name is Laszlo, and today I'm going to be walking you through step by step how I made this silver signet ring. I'll be covering a lot of ground, so in order to make it a bit more manageable, I broke the video into distinct sections, for which I'm going to insert chapter marks for easier navigation. Now that that's out of the way, let's create something beautiful. I start by preparing the wooden ring template I created in my last video. As you may see, I lined the inside of the ring with a layer of electrical tape to create a tighter fit around my index finger. You will see why this is important later on. Then, I went ahead and trimmed the excess tape off using a utility blade to make it flush with the rest of the ring, just like demonstrated here. Next, it's time to break out the casting sand. This particular type of sand I'm using is called Petrobond, and it's a more cost-effective alternative to Delft clay. The latter is better for conveying more details onto the final product, but since the ring I'm casting has no intricate details that I need transferring, I just opted for this. I start chopping up the sand with a protractor in order to make it loose and fluffy and easier to assume the shape around the object I'm trying to cast. The finer you break it up, the better it's supposed to be. I'll take a couple of minutes here until I'm happy with the texture. Next, I take the male half of the casting mold and place it with the base facing up. I start filling it up with sand while simultaneously compressing it with my hands. Once the container is overflowing, I start packing the sand down even harder by tapping on it with a hammer. The more I hammer, the more condensed the sand will be, and the more detail it will in turn transfer onto the final product. However, there are disadvantages to making the sand too dense also. I'll talk about these later in the video. After the first round of hammering, I turn my mold around and inspect the casting surface. I'm still seeing some imperfections, small cavities, and discontinuities in the sand, so I turn it around and give it another few taps. That looks somewhat better. Now, I can move on to the next step, which is covering the surface with baby powder. This will help in the separation of the two halves of the mold, preventing the sand from merging together in the following steps. As you see, I'm applying a generous amount of powder, distributing it with light strokes using a fine brush. I won't stop until the entire surface is covered nicely and evenly. Next, it's time to cover my wooden ring template in the same baby powder. Before I do so, however, I press down the tape inside the ring one last time to make sure it doesn't separate during the forces applied to it in the next steps. I simply drop the wooden ring in the cup with the baby powder and whisk it around with my brush till the entire thing is coated and pale. Doing this will enable me to remove the template from the mold come time. Next, I place the ring onto the prepared surface and start pressing it gently but firmly into the sand. It is paramount that I press it exactly straight down, as if I do not, separating the mold and removing the ring will become close to impossible without issues later on. As I press the ring inside the sand, you will see it wanting to come back out. That is mostly due to the sand being pegged down tight, and as you are introducing a new volume into it, the sand has nowhere to go and it will partially resist. But as you press harder and go deeper, it will eventually give and rise up around the object you're introducing. Once I push the ring about halfway in, I reach for my trusty protractor once more to use its flat nature to my advantage and press down the sand around the ring. This will simply ensure that the sand sits tightly against our wooden template, as when I pressed it in, some sand rose up and it became a little looser, so I'm just recondensing it locally. I apply the same treatment to the inside of the ring. Using the flat end of a tool, I tap the sand down within the ring. I'm gonna apply some more baby powder to the bare half of the ring. Next, it's time to join the two halves of the mold. Mine has a little marker, so I can align them consistently. I line everything up and proceed to fill it up with the rest of the sand. First, I compress everything by hand, and then move on to the hammer. Once everything is sufficiently condensed, I make sure that the two halves are still aligned at the mark, as these can shift under the hammer taps, so it is important to do so. Had they shifted, I'd have to twist them back into alignment and repeat the hammer treatment one more time to have the sand reset the right way. Now, onto the first critical moment in this process, the separation. Since this is the first time I've ever done any type of metal casting, this was one of the steps I struggled with the most. So many ways it can go wrong. Here are just a few of my failed attempts spliced in. This is where the liberal amount of baby powder comes into play. This is where taking the time to cover the template in powder and pressing the ring into the sand exactly straight down pays its dividends. I take my time, slowly pulling the two halves apart as straight as I can, never twisting and trying to keep the rocking to a minimum. Since my two halves are reluctant to separate at first, I cannot avoid some rocking to break it loose, but thankfully everything comes out perfectly. I blow off the excess sand from the surface with a sigh of great relief and move on to the next step. Carving out the pour funnel. For this, I'm going to start with a big flathead screwdriver, carving a path from the pouring hole in my mold almost all the way to the ring. Before I reach the ring, however, I'm going to stop. You may notice that I stop a lot farther away in the half where there is no ring. That is because I want to be more careful here, so that the sand doesn't cave into my ring imprint, which is a very real possibility. Next, I employ the services of a small flathead screwdriver to take it all the way and finish the job. It is worth taking the time to make the pour funnel as perfect as we can to avoid a bad cast later on. This process is meticulous and requires a lot of finesse. I don't want any obstructions in the way of the molten silver, nor any loose sand getting in there. To that end, I use my finger to tap down the sand and smooth everything out. Once this important phase is complete, it is time to add the breathing holes. For this, I'm using a small diameter drill bit. These holes will help the air inside the mold escape as we start pouring in the molten metal. Otherwise, the air trapped inside will prevent the silver from filling in the entirety of the shape. I make 5 air holes all around the ring by pushing the drill bit straight through. Here's a quick tip. I do this to the half where the ring is still present. Reason being, first I did it the other way, and the extra volume of the drill bit introduced actually made the sand cave into the ring imprint, and I had to start all over. I suppose another drawback of condensing the sand down too much. Next, I connect the air holes to the ring imprint via breathing channels. I just step the sand down in a straight line from the ring to the air holes. I find that this works better than dragging the screwdriver along the sand, as that raises and introduces extra sand particles to the surface that I have to blow off later. Once I'm done with the air channels, I'm ready to move on to the next pivotal moment in this process, removing the ring template from the mold. Before I do so, however, I will tap the sand down inside the ring, as this has a tendency to come out with the rest of the ring during the step, thus ruining the mold. Now, I'm ready to start. I do so by gently rocking and tapping on the ring from all different directions until it dislodges from the sand gripping it. This will become evident by it starting to move as I agitate it. Once I reach this point, it's a matter of getting a firm hold of the ring template and pulling it exactly straight up, slowly but smoothly, to avoid any cave-ins of the sand, which again is a very real possibility. That came out perfect. I blow away any residual sand that may be lingering around the surface before moving on to combining the two halves of the mold. I pack a little sand in the seams, as they are a little loose-fitting. This should make it a tighter friction fit, so they stay together well. As I am putting the two halves together, I also make sure to align the markers as I'm pressing them together, never twisting them thereafter. Otherwise, our ring will come out ruined, and once again, I have to restart. Once I combine them, I put it down to wait its turn. Next, I'm going to turn my attention to the crucible. As I mentioned earlier, I have not done sandcasting before this. Therefore, I had to order a new crucible from Amazon for this project. When they're new, they look like this with a limestone-like chalky surface texture. This is not going to work for me like this. I need to glaze it first with some borax before any silver can touch it. If I were to melt the silver in it now, it would just stick to the crucible, essentially ruining it and wasting the silver. In order to glaze the crucible, I'll need to heat it till it's glowing red, and then sprinkle some borax into it, and then repeat. The heat will melt the borax and coat the surface of the crucible, essentially making it stick-free for our purposes. I am using a MAP gas burner throughout this project, as it burns at higher temperatures than a regular butane torch. I picked this one up from my local home department store. Alright, this is what it's supposed to look like in the end. If you notice, the entire surface is now glossy and glass-like. Now we're ready to melt some silver. I purchased some sterling silver grain from Amazon to have some reserves in store, but I have some old silver jewelry that's either too small, broken, or plain outdated that I wanted to use for this particular project. Most of these items were given to me as a gift from relatives and loved ones, so there's some emotional attachment and sentimental value associated with them. And that is the whole point. As a man, I would never go out and buy a piece of jewelry just because I liked the way it looked. That would just feel tacky and uncomfortable to me. I'm certainly not judging people who do that, I'm just not one of them. If I'm going to wear an item on my person, I want it to have some meaning, a memory, or a strong emotional charge connected to it. I want it to have a story, to remind me of a better time, and or motivate me. Anyway, rant over. I make sure all of them bear the 925 mark, denoting the 92.5% silver content, making it sterling silver. Alright, let's get to it. I'll place my prepared mold on some fire bricks I had lying around from my salad days when I was making knives. They're not really needed, just a nice to have. At this point you might be confused, since I'm putting a seemingly ready ring into the crucible with some other scraps of silver. Also, my crucible seems to have acquired some color since last time we saw it. The reason for this is because I have actually made and remade this ring multiple times for various reasons. The very first time I cast it, I simply underestimated the amount of silver I would need and came up with this little number. Then, I added more silver and remelted it over and over and over. At first, it was mostly due to casting mistakes or issues. Then, as I refined the process, it was because of my mistakes, mostly to do with the final finishing. This particular version of the ring, I'm melting down because I made the hole too wide where it could easily slip off my index finger. Hence the electrical tape I added to the inside in the very first step of the process. At some point, when the silver is melted down, I add some borax to separate out the impurities in the silver and make them float to the surface. Then, I heat it back up till it's completely liquid and has no amorphous chunks in it. Then I move closer to my mold and prepare to commit to the pour. And bam! It's out and it's in. On this particular occasion, I turned my gas off before I made the pour. Knowing what I know now, I would advise anyone doing this to keep heating the silver right up until the moment of pouring, and potentially even during. Since I am doing this indoors, with wood all around me, I also need to be careful. I'll let my mold sit for 10 or 15 minutes while I'm hoping for the best. Once it's reasonably cool, I pick it up with my gloves and separate the two halves to behold my creation. At first glance, that looks pretty good. I'll clean it up with some water and subject it to a thorough inspection. That seems pretty darn good, unless my eyes are cheated by some spell. The seams look good. I don't see any unsightly pitting, nor any major defects, and it's tight enough to where it won't go over my knuckle. It meets my OCD standards and is ready to move on to the next part of the assembly line. I found some wood scraps from a previous project when I built a cat tree and set up a little rig on my makeshift workbench buddy using a clamp. I've seen other ring makers on YouTube use similar, albeit slightly more elaborate setups. This will help me hold the ring relatively stable during the proceedings, since I don't have an actual workbench or vise, etc. First things first, I need to remove the sprue, aka the extra silver in the bottom. For this, I use a mini handsaw and a whole lot of determination, as metal is pretty arduous to cut through manually, even one as soft as sterling silver. After a considerable amount of cutting, cursing, and time expenditure, I'm done separating the sprue. Next, I take a metal file to it in order to address the seams and these little offshoots from the breathing channels. I go around the ring and start filing everything down, making it flush with the rest of the walls. Once the worst of it is gone, I move on to the bottom of the ring where I just cut. I start filing to remove the excess silver and make it flush with all the rest. Lastly, I'll give the sealing surface a few strokes to get it nice and flattish. That will do for now. So next, I move on to the rough sanding phase. I'm using 150 grit sandpaper to remove the remaining seams, elevations, and irregularities. First, I start out on my improvised rig. before ultimately moving on to handheld sanding. At this stage, I'm primarily focusing on the outer parts of the ring walls to blend in the seams, as well as the bottom part where there's still a distinct outline where I cut the excess silver off. That looks significantly better. The seams are barely distinguishable and no clear sign of separation in the bottom area. At this point, I feel comfortable moving onto the inside part of the ring. I use an improvised tool by using a cylindrical handle that I wrapped some sandpaper around. It fits nicely inside the ring and will make quick work of the protruding seams. Once the seams have been reduced enough, I can move on to my patented finger sanding method from the previous video. I roll the sandpaper around my finger, insert my fingertip into the ring, and start pressing against the wall, applying an even amount of pressure as I roll the ring around my finger. This will take some time since I made the ring extra tight, intentionally. During previous attempts, by the time I sufficiently removed all the casting defects from the inside and was done polishing, the ring would feel too loose around my finger. That's why I introduced the electrical tape to the wooden template in the initial steps, to address this very issue. After much sanding, the inside of the ring looks flawless and I can barely get it past the knuckle. At this point, I stop immediately and move on to the 400 grit sandpaper to finish it all off and remove any deep scratches the 150 grit sandpaper may have left. I only use the 400 grit shortly before stopping altogether. The reason for this is because I want to address an interesting phenomenon I learned about while undertaking this project. Namely, how the human finger changes size throughout the day. This is due to a combination of reasons: outside temperature, dilation of the blood vessels, water retention, humidity levels, etc., etc. Here, for instance, is me trying to get my newly refined ring onto my index finger in the morning hours. The same finger it went onto without issues the evening before. At the moment, however, I can barely get it past my knuckle, and were I to move further, it would surely require medical attention to remove it. Contrast that to the evening of the same day. It pops on with almost no resistance. I made the mistake of sanding the hole in the ring, where it fit great during the warm, swollen hours, but when it got colder and my fingers shrunk, the ring was too big. Due to this, I decided to take my time finalizing the hole gradually over the coming days, sanding little by little. While I'm here, I also do a survey of the current state of my ring. I identify areas with imperfections that require further sanding. Now that I cataloged all the areas I need to work on, I move on to the fine sanding. At this point, I'll be only using 400 grit sandpaper. This will look very similar to the rough sanding process. That is because it's essentially the same with finer sandpaper. At this point, my only purpose is to remove any blemishes and refine my ring. This will also address any of the deep scratches the file or the rougher sandpaper may have left during the earlier stages. I start with the outside walls of the ring, before moving on to the face. Alright, it's looking better by the minute. Now, it's time to address the part I neglected so far, and arguably the most relevant part of a signet ring, the sealing surface. I lay down some sandpaper on a flat table and start scraping the ring sealing surface first against it, applying even pressure. Before long, the entire thing is nice and flat. When I only see minor imperfections on the surface, I lose the 400 grit paper and move on to the 2000 grit to finish it until I see nothing but a continuous shining surface. That looks better than I could have ever imagined, and at this stage, I'm starting to get excited. Over the next few days, I continue boring out the hole in my ring, first going with 400 grit paper, and then polish it up with the 2000 grit. Then, I try it on in the morning and evening hours of the day, and repeat until I get a ring that fits great throughout the day. Snugger in the morning, looser in the evening. Lastly, after some internal debate whether to polish it or not, I give in and decide to apply the 2000 grit paper to the entire ring. I really like the handmade, unrefined, rustic look, but at the same time I want the ring to work in all scenarios of life, from casual to formal. I go through the same main areas, the outer walls of the ring, the face, I also address the sealing surface one more time to remove any scratches I may have introduced while polishing the walls. And lastly, the inside of the ring one last time. At this point, I'm happy with how it's looking. It is something I will proudly wear. And with that, I present to you the final product. This project has taught me a lot about patience and perseverance, and every time I look at this ring, I will remember the challenges I had to overcome to ultimately arrive to this point. I've acquired a great deal of respect for the ancient art of sandcasting throughout this process. This is a constant reminder that you can do anything you set your mind to right on my finger. I will wear it proudly and with great joy. One day, I may even engrave it with my monogram, family crest, or a coat of arms if I ever obtain one. But for now, I'm content with just leaving it as is. It may even become a family heirloom one day that I can pass down.